Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we will be talking about how to invest for beginners. We're in 2025 and we're going to be talking about what to do now and looking forward to the future. And I have my very good friend, Andrew Craig, who is the author of How to Own the World, one of the best books I have ever listened to. I actually listened to that, and that's how I got in touch. It was around about 2016, 2017 with Andrew, and ever since we ended up becoming friends, and we've done several podcasts. So stick around if you want to know about finances and get your money in order. Andrew, the pleasure is all mine. I love doing these with you, mate.
Yeah, me too. And although I think I said this last time, I feel very sorry for you that you listened to like 9 hours of me talking on the audiobook. I always feel really sorry for people who go for the audiobook. It's like, geez, I don't think my wife could listen to me for 9 hours.
You
Definitely
know what?
not.
If you haven't checked it out, it will pop up and it will also be in the show notes in the description. But I have to say, as you put it was nice to have the layman's terms, because there are other books
Mm,
out there where you listen and you think, am I taking this in? And it really wasn't. It was very self-explanatory, very easy to digest. And that's how we ended up connecting on LinkedIn. And here we are today, years later. So look,
yeah,
let's not beat around the bush. This is for beginners. This is for people who perhaps don't have their finances in order. Let's start
yeah,
by talking about the very beginning. A working
yeah,
person, family, responsibilities,
yeah.
working a job, but now realizes I better start getting my money in order. Where do they go?
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's so much to say. The first thing I want to say, which I always go back to, is this stuff is so much more important than sort of society as a whole realizes. It's really important because every single person who can sort this out, it's life changing for them. And that phrase gets thrown around to me. Oh, it's life changing. It's like it is life changing. The evidence is really clear, and if you do even a tiny bit of work on it, it's life changing. But and another thing I bang on about a lot is that if enough million people understand this stuff, get this education, and take the sort of actions that I know you talk about as well, I talk about, that will be extremely positive for British society. And a big part of why we're in the pickle we're in economically is because so many millions of people don't understand this stuff, haven't been taught this stuff, and are not doing this stuff. And then the next thing I want to say is a general comment, which I always say is it's nowhere near as hard or scary or complicated as most people think it is. And the analogy I always go back to, which I know I've said before and you've heard before, but I sort of unapologetically repeat it because I think people find it quite useful, is learning how to drive your finances as a life skill to a life-changing outcome is truly no harder than learning how to drive a car. And 70+% of British adults, like 42 million British people, have a driving license. And I reckon not even 400,000 British people really, really understand finance in a properly effective way and how to invest. So that's just to set the scene. Like, it's super important. It could make life better for millions of people. It can make life better for in our country. Truly, there'd be more capital available for people to open restaurants or build airlines or shops. Or the state of our high streets right now is largely a function of the fact that our stock market's dying, and that's a function of the fact that nobody invests. But in terms of the simplest, like fastest route from A to B kind of way of sorting this out, the first thing I want to say about that is it's really important to understand that what we're talking about today, what I always talk about, is investing, not trading, right? And a big problem we have nowadays, sort of in British society, particularly in social media culture and, influencers and, trading groups and crypto and all this stuff, is far too many people sort of wake up and go, I really need to sort this finance thing out, right? Because look at my mate, they're wealthier than me, or I read a book by a millionaire about how to become a millionaire, and there's all these sort of truths about finance and financial literacy and investing in the stock market. I think the good news is that more people today know that that is something that they should be doing and thinking about. The bad news is that there's like 2 centuries of evidence that investing has a very high chance of delivering a life-changing result, right? And there's almost as many years of evidence that trading doesn't. And the stats that if you ever look at any of the spread bidding companies, for example, they are legally obliged by the FCA to share the stats that 70 to 80% of traders lose money factually. And it's like all this commentary. Oh no, Bitcoin's gone from this price to this price. Okay, so Bitcoin, let's say it's gone from $1,000 to $100,000. And loads of people crying about how much, Bitcoin, if you'd bought it here, but that's one story, the price moving from one point to another point. That doesn't tell you anything about the tens of thousands of stories of individuals along the way who've actually lost money because of the role of psychology. And so, trading generally is really hard. It's really time consuming, and very, very few people make money out of it in the long run, as boring and old manish as that sounds. So, by the way, just to be clear, if you want to learn how to trade, if you want to spend many hours of your life every month looking at screens and learning how to trade, that's fine. But my message is always that far more important than that, which gives you a far higher probability of success, even if it requires more patience, is investing. And just to be clear what investing is, investing is very simply allocating a certain amount of what you earn every single month / year / whatever, over whichever time period, but ideally every month, from the moment you start earning money until the moment where the day comes that you can live on the money you've built. And obviously that's most conventionally called a pension. So everybody like, oh, that's what, but actually if you do that really well, and if you start young enough, and if you know what you're doing, you can get to sort of enough money to live on, or at least to have a really big supplementary effect on your life and on your income and on your wealth, actually quite a few years before retirement age. And there's this the FIRE movement now that people talk about that, but you don't need to be that extreme. But so broadly, like I sense I'm rambling on and monologuing at you, and I'll shut up. But the broad point is, it's much easier than people realize. You've got to focus on investing, and if you do something every month, and investing is basically sorting your pension out and sorting out a stocks and shares ISA. Those are the two fundamental building blocks. And if you do that in the right kind of mix over many years of your life, and then implement a bunch of the stuff that I guess we're going to come on to, big picture, like, okay, so what do I actually do? And that's also a relatively easy question to answer for all sorts of structural reasons. You have a really good chance, almost no matter how much you earn, of having a large 6 or low 7-figure amount of money 20 to 30 and certainly 40 years later. Like if you do it from 25 to 65, even if you're on the median British salary at the moment, the salary that the largest number of people in this country have is 36 grand. And in London, it's more like 55 grand. So on those sorts of incomes, if you do this for 40 years, from 25 to 65, you're almost, you got to be very careful about saying guarantee, but there's a very, very high statistical probability you will be a millionaire. You'll be an asset millionaire, right? And the tragedy is that tens of millions of people are not doing this. Everyone can drive. 42 million British adults have a driving license. A tiny, tiny number of British adults actually understand any of the stuff that I teach, and I know you talk about a lot as well. So I think I'll stop there, because that was like a 10-minute ramble at you.
It's all beneficial, and there's a lot of learning in this podcast. I just want to jump back to the education side of this. So I feel now that we're in a world where I don't know if there is a valid excuse anymore, because as you touched on, and it's the same for business, it is not as scary, it's not as daunting, and it doesn't require this high level entry to get involved in investing. Yeah. I feel that we are now in a situation where we know it's not taught at schools. We can keep banging on about that. I feel like that's a bit of this saying of it should be taught in schools. There's no point saying it anymore, because it's not going to be. But what we can control is the sheer amount of access to knowledge, and knowing that this is what we need to do. But more so looking at the economy and the landscape and going, this is getting bad. Like, as we were saying offline, is that this is getting tough. And so
it's never been more important to sort it out yourself, basically, because the government isn't going to be able to sort it out for you, factually, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So I struggle when people say, well, I can't invest. And I always use this one, and I say, well, could you do £1 a week? And the normal answer, which I find mind-boggling, is, well, yeah, I could do £1, but what's the point in that? And it's the frustration. So I'll leave you with Andrew, and then you can touch on this. There is no excuse not to learn about how to invest and manage your money.
I think that's right. Although said against that, to give people their due, right? What I will say is there's a brilliant, there's a US like sort of modern philosopher whose name escapes me. He's written a few really great books, and one of his phrases is, if information was all you needed, we'd all be billionaires with washboard abs, with a six-pack or whatever, right? And it's like, and in finance, that's particularly true, because having the right information, learning the right information is necessary and step one. The next bit, though, is all about psychology. and it's becoming psychologically strong, so you have the confidence in the information you've learned and patience and discipline, and you do it over many, many years. And that is actually really hard for people to do. I mean, it's absolutely crucial you do it if you want the outcome, if you want that life-changing outcome I talked about, but it isn't easy. And I think I used the example before, but psychologists, so for example, I used an example in a podcast interview I did a few months ago where I said, the £1,000 flat screen TV that a 25-year-old buys, if that money is invested into something that returns what the US stock market's returned for the last century, they'll have £63,000 by the time they're 65 from that 1,000. That's 63 times your money. After inflation, it's more like 15x. It's 15x your money. But it's like, you can tell people that, and say, if you go without a certain amount of your consumption in your 20s, particularly in your 20s, because obviously the longer it compounds, the more money you'll have in your 50s or 60s. It will have, you will be wealthy and you won't be immensely poor, because most people are sleepwalking towards being extremely poor, because governments all over the world, doesn't matter whether you're left wing, right wing, Labour, Tory, Republican, Democrat, what the governments have done for the last 40 or 50 years with interest rate policy and inflation and printing money and basically means that it is not possible for any political party or any government or any regime in most of the developed world, with a few exceptions like Norway, Australia, Singapore, which we can maybe come back to because they've had much better policy. They will not be able to fund people who want to retire at like 55 or 60 for 30 years of their life. And so, you have to sort it out yourself. But to go back to my psychology point is, psychologists tell us, so basically you're saying you're 25, sacrifice a decent chunk of your income. Don't spend it on Deliveroo. Don't spend it on, going on a nice holiday, get a cheaper car, live in a not as nice neighborhood or flat, blah, 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 all this stuff, so that your 65-year-old self cannot have to eat cat food, and be super poor and have no healthcare and the problem is, psychologically, the way we think of our 65-year-old future self when we're 25 is that person is as much a stranger to us as a random 65-year-old that you don't know, that you walk past in the street. And so so psychologically it's really hard to go, well, I don't have any emotive sense of why I should make my future self's life better. Like, I'd rather just spend the money, I'd rather go out this weekend, right? Or whatever. But you've got to fight that. You've got to be aware of it, then you've got to fight it, because if you don't, to go back to my point, I always talk about the carrot and the stick, and the stick is part of the reason that society has a massive problem at the moment, particularly in Britain, is because far too few people know this stuff and far too people are sorting it out, as in tens of millions of people, right? Which is challenging their life. Basically, increasingly, people who haven't sorted out are going to have a really, really awful, adulthood, right? And certainly old adulthood, which is going to suck if you want to retire at 60 and you're going to live to 90, like biologically, right? And so, people have to take charge of, that's the stick. But the carrot is, as you well know, with all of my output and my writing and stuff, is genuinely, it's much easier than people realize. And just a final comment on that before I shut up again is, and the reason for that, the reason investment works over long periods of time, basically, most capital markets, and particularly the stock market, over time go from bottom left to top right. Now, the reason for that, front and center, is because of human progress. It's not whiz bang trading. It's not ripping somebody else's face off. It's not a zero sum thing of like, rich people are rich because they've screwed over everybody else. It's like that, there's income inequality, and that's another topic. But the reason that anybody who's willing to get to grips with investment, particularly stock market investment, and willing to do it for many years of their life, is very likely to have a life-changing outcome and be much wealthier than anybody who doesn't do that. We can come back to income inequality and fairness and whatever, but the simple fact is, people who do that are going to be wealthy. People who don't do that are not going to be wealthy, right? And the reason for that is very simply because you're getting financial exposure to human progress. It's not any more complicated than that. 100 years ago, that nobody flew in airplanes apart from royalty, right, and prime ministers. Today, billions of people fly. That's the aviation industry is worth trillions of dollars. 100 years ago, there was no shipping industry. We hadn't even invented the shipping container, the standard 20-ton shipping container. Look around you today. The reason we can buy all these products from, you walk into a supermarket or Boots or whatever and look around you, the extraordinary number of products that we all have access to, fairly inexpensively, notwithstanding inflation recently. That wasn't true 100 years ago. The market in your local town, you could have a bit of rubbish meat and you could have whatever vegetables were in season. They're like, there was no internet, there were no smartphones, there was no aviation industry. Well, I've already said that. And it's like all of that, if you have a financial involvement in that real human progress, that is how you become wealthier than people who don't. And it's kind of self-evident. And the tragedy is that far too few people understand that or understand how to do it. And it's actually really easy to do it.
Okay, so let's dive into the psychology because this is what I'm interested in. And I'll just use, because we can use several takes on this, and I think it explains it perfectly. And then the outlook can be on finances, it can be on anything. Human beings don't tend to do things until it's too late. And I remember reading a book of Robert Kiyosaki, and I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was Cash Flow Quadrant, but he spoke about just take yourself to 65 years old with what you are doing right now, and which is hard for people to do because, again, I'm going to dive into it, is that we don't like to accept reality of what could be because it's scary. It's like vinegar on a wound, I always say. And so it's better to be blindfolded and put the blinkers on and not think about what could be because we know the reality is it could be awful. But I think if people were able to travel into the future and actually look at their life, what it would be, it would scare them so much that when they come back to their body in the present moment, they would instantly change their life like that. And it's the same with unhealthy people. They go to the doctors, cholesterol through the roof, blood pressure. You've got 3 months. You probably won't walk your daughter down the aisle. The damage has been done. And then they turn around and go, I wish I could go back. I wish, and it's always the same classic case of I wish I could go back in time. And that's why this conversation that we're having now, and anyone that listens, your moment right now to change is now, and you have to apply discipline and delayed gratification. And I'm sure you agree, Andrew, this is what separates the average from the people who do really well, is the level of disciplines to not put the pizza in the mouth, to not spend the money on the new iPhone, but to put that in and overcome. And I just want to share something to overcome this societal norm of, oh, well, that sounds really boring. Like I track
or hard, or I can't be. Yeah, exactly.
It's the classic case of like, even when I homeschool my son and stuff, people are like, oh, well, how's he going to fit in with society? I'm like, I don't want him to fit in with society. Have you seen society?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Society? I don't want my son to fit into this chaos and this noise and
well, sadly, particularly in the UK, if you lived, I mean, slightly controversial thing to say, maybe, but if you lived in Switzerland, Singapore, Australia, nice bits of the United States, although the US isn't perfect, but the UK is particularly dreadful, and for a whole bunch of structural reasons, and we can argue about why that is. But if I can just comment on, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but the one sort of, if you like, I want to square it, right? I want to turbocharge what you're saying, because where a lot of people fail to understand how big this gets is because 60% of British adults, when surveyed, which means that probably it's more like 65 or 70%, don't understand the mathematics of compounding, right? And the reason that, so if you take a 20-year-old with good habits and another 20-year-old with less good habits, to your point about eating the pizza or drinking the booze or not going to the gym or not learning about investment, and fast forward 10 years to when they're 30, you won't see much difference. Like one of them will be a bit, but in less good shape. One of them will be slightly fitter. One of them might have a slightly better job. One of them might have saved a bit more money, but broadly, they'll probably still be mates. They'll meet each other in the pub, whatever, and their lives won't look massively different. But fast forward to when they're 60, one of them will be a multimillionaire, or at least very, very comfortably off, and the other one will be in all sorts of trouble and worried about whether the government's going to be able to afford to put them into a care home. Well, when they're 80 or whatever, because of the mathematical power of compounding, and it's true of absolutely everything you do. And that, again, there's a carrot and a stick there, because the stick is, if you compound badly in all of your life habits, whether it's finance or fitness or whatever it is, or interpersonal relationships or reading or whatever you want to talk about, the stick is that the divergence, it's like you change the trajectory of an airliner, right? 1 degree, and it ends up in Rio de Janeiro instead of Boston. I mean, literally, right? That's what happens over time. And the stick is that, yeah, if you're on the wrong part of that compounding trajectory, by the time you're much older, that is front and center why your life is going to be absolutely rubbish. And you're going to look around you and go, oh, look at all these rich bastards. Like, well, they're the ones who compounded well for 30 years. But the good news is that it's only a tiny course alteration. It doesn't, you don't need to go to the gym every single day. You don't need to become a genius, like expert on investment. You need to make a bunch of really small, there's a great book by a guy called Jeff Olson called The Slight Edge. And there are loads of books along a similar theme. It's like, literally, so I mean, here you go, mathematically, my example of two people aged 20, let's say they start at 100 each of like education, intelligence, and money, broadly, right? If they're each at 100 each, one of them gets 1% better each month, the other one stays the same. And realistically, you can introduce another mate who gets worse every year because they, drink loads of booze and
Always one.
yeah, exactly. So the bit that people really, really don't understand, because they really don't get the mathematics, they don't understand how extreme this is that the one who gets 1% better every month, 30 years later, they're not going to be twice as rich as the one that stays the same. They're going to be 35 times as rich. And this is like, there's an element to which inequality is a function of merit times compounding. There's also plenty of other reasons. Society is not structured optimally, for sure. There are bad actors. Actually, the more government there is, the more bad actors and more cronyism there tends to be, like Michelle Mone, obviously the example in COVID, all that stuff. The more places like Singapore, basically there's the economic freedom index. So, North Korea is about as corrupt as it possibly gets. And the further down the line you get to economic freedom index, which is free markets and, people being incentivized to invest and stuff, the fairer society gets. But the trouble is that you'll never, you'll still get the massive impact of merit times compounding. That means that over 30 years, the person who gets 1% better each month is going to be dozens of times better off than the person who doesn't. And, to fitness, right? Look, I put this in my third book, Our Future is Biotech. Somebody does 20 press-ups a day, just 20 press-ups. That's 7,300 press-ups a year. Okay, so after 10 years, it's 73,000 press. So the man or woman who does 20 press-ups every single day of their life, pretty much without fail, and the person who doesn't, after 10 years, one of them's done 73,000 more press-ups than the person who doesn't do any at all. And if you look at it on each day, isn't that you can't really see any difference? Like one of them spent 3 minutes doing this thing and one of them didn't. But you apply that to the number of steps you walk every day, and crucially, the one who invests 25 quid a month in their early 20s, which they bump up to 50 quid a month in their late 20s, which they bump up to 100 quid a month in their early 30s, which they eventually, if they're lucky and they work hard and they have a decent job, they may be able to start. I mean, so in my second book, Live on Less, Invest the Rest, I give the example of somebody on 36 grand a year. And at the moment, the government mandates that they have to have 5% in their pension and 3% from the employer, like anybody who's employed. So that basically is about 200 quid a month from a salary sacrifice of their own money going to pension and the rest coming from the employer. So that's 200 quid a month. Somebody on 36 grand a year will be netting about 2,400 after tax, right? So less than 10% that. So 10% of that is 240 quid. So less than, just call it 200 quid. So a person on a median British salary should be able to save and invest 400 quid a month. Now, if you can save and invest 400 quid a month and make close to stock market returns from, let's say, your mid-20s or maybe more realistically, your late 20s or around about the time you turn 30, if you do that from 30 to 60, you will be pretty well off. And the tragedy is nobody realizes that. And the difference between, not putting any money aside and putting a little bit of money aside and getting into that habit is that point I made. Somebody's on an airplane that's going to end up in Boston and the other one's on an airplane that's going to end up in Rio from a tiny change today. And that's really poorly understood.
What's interesting as well on the power of compounding is it's exactly the same, and we'll come on to this and how this distracts people from making better financial decisions. There's two things. I'll start with the whole compounding and consumption of social media. So this is what annoys me for people who say they can't invest, they can't change their life, they can't make progress. Is one of the excuses we've come up with as humans is we don't have time. But it's now proven that the average consumer who has access to social media is a minimum of 3 hours consumption a day doom scrolling. That over the year is 1,094 hours. That is 45 days and 12 hours every year. people are losing over a month based on the minimum of consumption of social media rather than making active moves. So that's point number one. The compound effect,
Mm,
negative or positive, is very real and it has a big impact.
mm.
Habits. This is an interesting one, which I've done some videos on recently. We often hear the terminology, well, I've got really bad habits, or "Oh, I've got a tendency to, spend money when I shouldn't." And
I
I
am
think,
this way kind of thing. Yeah,
yeah,
like
and
yeah,
again,
this is just the
it
way
we
I am.
yeah, we've come up with our own excuses when actually it's just bad decisions.
Mm.
No one has a gun to anyone's head. Again, it baffles me and it frustrates me where people say, "Well, I haven't got any money because my wife divorced me." Okay, well, let's go back to the core. Why did she divorce you? Well, I was a pain in the ass.
Mm.
Okay, so you have to take ownership for that. Like you have to take ownership for the result of where you
Yeah.
are, where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. And we're so quick to pass the blame. Just
I think,
quickly,
although if I can just, I think that's right. But like, look, I think I think most people have much more agency and choice about the outcome of their lives than they realize. And you're right. If you doom scroll for 3, in the time you've spent doom scrolling that you just articulated, you could have read a book every week. There's some book app online that advertises called Blinkist, and it's like the average CEO reads 60 books a year, and there's all these trolls going, "That's bollocks. That's impossible. Nobody can possibly do it." And I have for 30 years, or thereabouts, right? And I once posted, well, like, basically a page a minute, which isn't actually even that reading that fast. So on my commute, I can read 30 pages in the morning, 30 pages in the evening. The average book is X hundred pages that I can read one a week, right? So, but all I did want to just quickly inject though, in defense of, there are genuinely people, like, for example, your child is seriously disabled, and that requires tens of thousands of pounds worth of, ramps in the house, and there are people in tragic circumstances. But the irony is, if you read the biographies of Helen Keller, or like all these sorts of people who've been unbelievable, or people who, like, I saw a guy who's a quadruple amputee present to a conference in Sweden a few years ago. He lost his arms and his legs in a mountaineering accident, and he's on the circuit doing inspirational talks, and probably makes, I don't know, 200 grand a year. Who knows? He's talking to big investment banks in international cities. And but so my point is, I think we do have to give some quarter to people who just, circumstances transpire against you, because there are tragic things that happen in your life, and you got to be tolerant of that. But I think you're right. The majority of people have far more agency, and particularly when it comes to finance, to learn about it and do it, and get a life-changing result. And I think one of the first steps to that is understanding enough about it to see the evidence for 200 years, by the way, to consume stuff that gives you the evidence that it is possible. And sadly, far, far few people ever do that and ever get that.
well, I will second the fact that you can really educate yourself far more than what you believe. I mean, I do between 20 to 50 books a year, and that's typically just
Mm.
one audible book a week, and you become a much wiser individual at the end of the year. So, yeah, definitely,
Well, no,
read
by the
books.
way, just sorry, that I've spoken to quite a few schools and quite a few universities over the years, and that getting 1% better a month thing, which is utterly life changing on every front, on exercise, people are like, well, how do you do that? Like, tangibly, how do you do that? And I said, you know what? If there's only one piece of advice ever that I'll give you, to your point, read books. Like, seriously, like, every other element of your life will fall into place if you spend time consuming long form content, 300, 400-page books, 200-page books, as a matter of an absolute gilt-edged commitment to yourself, life priority. Because if you commit to reading a book, at least say one or two a month, let's say, and fiction and non-fiction, because fiction's really inspiring and there's loads of info that's useful in fiction, but non-fiction too. But if you do that, the dividends it will pay, you just will watch a bit less television because it's a habit, because in the evening you'll go and lie down and read a book instead of going and watching another hour of Netflix. There's a campaign being run by my publisher at the moment, actually, around the fact that some horrendous percentage of children just don't read anymore, and basically saying that above parental income, above where you grew up, like, basically the number one correlate for future life success, health, happiness, income, above everything else about how much your parents earned, what education you had, whether you went to a private school or state school, or whether you went to uni, the number one factor that correlates with success and wealth and health and happiness is a reading habit. So like, I'm getting on my soapbox, but I really want to really stress that because it's
Yeah,
true.
I would. I'll second it. Education. I would go just another step before we move on to the next subject. Is I would say education all the time
Mm,
and your
mm,
social circle. And I would
mm.
agree that everything else in your life will fall into place. When I talk to people about starting a business, they're always so fixated on finding the thing. Like I didn't
The
know.
idea, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know I was going to go in. I mean, got a tattoo on my neck. I'm covered in tattoos, but I ended up becoming very good at raising capital. And you've been to the office that I had in Mayfair, and I ended up dramatically doing something different to what my parents did. And I am. Let's put it this way: how many people in the finance world would you know with a tattoo on the neck? You know that better than I do.
There are more and more, mate, but most of them are much more successful than all the posh blokes in pinstripe suits, to be honest, nowadays.
Yeah, and the irony is actually some of the big investment bankers that I know that are pulling in 150, 160. I would say I'm sitting a little bit above them, but the
Yeah.
possibility is endless, right? Let's talk about type of investments at this stage, right? So we've given a great sort of backstory and really kind of the landscape and the possibility. I'll just give my two pence worth. I always say to people, the number one thing before you ever do anything else, you get excited about charts and you open up eToro and you want to buy this because Dave down the pub said it. I always
Yeah.
say the number one thing that you should have is an emergency fund.
Yeah.
That is no debt, ideal world, no debt, but let's assume
Yeah.
no debt, right? We won't talk about debt. That's a given. Emergency fund, a stocks and shares ISA, and then I would say learn about commodities. Those are kind of my three things:
Yeah.
emergency fund, stocks and shares ISA, and then start dibble dabbling in commodities before anything else. What's your recommendation? Not
Yeah, I mean,
advice.
I'm exactly the same. So without wanting to be too sort of promotional, that's my second book. It's called Live on Less, Invest the Rest. And so my first book, How to Own the World, is the theory. Like, what is the stock market? What's the history of capital markets? What is the bond market? Why is gold important? What's inflation? What are interest rates? And hopefully, so my business is called Plain English Finance, as you know, it's in plain English. If you read the reviews, people say that they understand it, and they don't. And some people even say that it's not boring, which was kind of the whole aim of it, is to try and demystify it and make it vaguely interesting and sort of tie it into human progress and exciting stuff. I mean, as a quick aside, by the way, one thing I love to kick around is, so if you Google the word pension and the word boring, you get like how many 100 million results, right? It's a really famous thing that pensions are boring. Accounting is boring. Pensions are boring. And I'd like to just take a step back from that and say that's one of the most stupid beliefs, like modern, conventional wisdoms that ever, because the reason for that is, think about what a pension actually is. For 99% of human beings who ever lived, they worked until they died. They died down the mine, or they died in a shipbuilding, or they died in a steel factory, or they died on a farm, plowing, right? Until we invented this incredible technology, the technology of capital markets and investment and stock markets. One of the expressions of that was a pension, which meant for the first time in human history, a tiny minority of human beings ever born in the history of the world were able to stop. They could realistically expect to stop working at some point, hopefully 20 plus years before they were going to die, and spend time with their grandkids and go to sports matches and travel and buy themselves the car they always dreamed, or so that is not boring, right? Pensions are far from boring. But anyway, what I was digressing is to go back to your point about the order of things. So you call it an emergency fund, I call it a rainy day pot. Oh yeah, no, I was just talking about the theory and the practice. So the practice in my book Live on Less, Invest the Rest is exactly that. There's a tick list. And so, yeah, emergency fund or rainy day pot, which needs to be at least a month, preferably 3 or even 6 months of living expenses for you and yours, right? But and you have to have that in place before you start investing in stocks and shares or anything else, because there's volatility. Stocks and shares go up and down, right? So you don't want to have money in something that goes down as your emergency pot. You then need the emergency pot. You can't get it out because it's gone down, right? Which I reckon a lot of people have experienced in crypto in recent years. The other thing I just want to like be very sure that we've covered off is, and you mustn't invest until you've paid down any debt and sorted out an emergency pot, because of what I just said. But also with debt, if so, the interest rate you will pay on any debt you have, credit card debt, store cards, whatever, loans, will absolutely front and center be likely to be far higher, the interest rate you're paying on it, than any returns that you will reliably make on investment, right? And anybody who tells you you should put, money on a credit card to invest in crypto is mad and giving you incredibly bad advice. That might work well for a little while, but my goodness me, if that goes against you, you will be hosed. And again, that goes back to my story of, oh look, crypto's gone from $400 to $100,000. Everyone's made money. No, they haven't. Along the way, 80% of people have lost money because somebody put 10 grand on their credit card to buy crypto at $40,000. It went to $20,000. They panic, they sell out, they've lost all their life savings. I hear these stories all the time, right? Because that's how it actually works. So to take a step back, so any money that you can free up in the first, and even if it takes years, this might take some of your 20s, particularly if you got yourself in debt in your early 20s. But if you get a discipline, do a good job, you make sure you pay down any outstanding debt first, then you have a rainy day pot. And so what if it takes you until you're 32 or 29 or whatever it does, right? But you've got to do it in that order, because it's really bad. It's a bad idea to make investments whilst you still have debt, because that's like the example I use in my book is like running a bath with the plug open, right? Where actually the rate of the water going down the plug will exceed the rate of the water coming into the bath. So as boring as that is, that's what you should do. And then, the next thing you need to think about, if you want to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, is very simply my pension and my ISA, right? So those are the two accounts. And again, I explain how to think about balancing those two, because there's a number of considerations. You can't access your pension until you're 55, and soon that's going to be 58. And probably by the time anybody young today wants to exercise, it will be 62 or 65, right? So any money you put in a pension is going to be tied up for years. So you have to think about that before you make that decision. But set against that, a lot of employers will put a certain amount of money into your pension, which is very good news. And the government does as well, because it comes out of your pre-tax salary, that you can put money into a pension. So that's really good too. So there are lots of reasons why it's good to put something in your pension. But you need to balance that with then a stocks and shares ISA as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling on, and I think you wanted to slightly, we'll come back to the next step.
I just want to quickly throw it in there because I've done a lot of videos on stop working hard recently. I did a video this morning on wage slavery, because it is totally true. And I watched an entire video, I can't remember the gentleman's name, and a video by Bob Proctor. These were years ago, of saying, I can never say this word, totalitarian, right? There's the one.
Yeah, totalitarian.
That's the one. And it's funny, isn't it? We hear that saying of where people in the day used to say, a bit of hard work won't kill you. I think you find it will, and it really will. Anyone listening, I do totally get it. And you touched on it, and I'm glad you did. It can come across as really boring. Oh, but it's so boring to invest. It's so slow, and it's nothing exciting about it. Whereas if I buy a bit of EasyJet and I spend my pocket money that I've earned, I could have a bit more excitement. Dieting to average people is boring. Yeah. But it's for the long run. So here we go. Hear me out on this, and anyone listening. One of the most common questions, one of the most asked questions every year in the top 10 on Google is how to make more money. Yeah. Majority of people, is above 60% of people are overweight. By their actual body mass index, they are overweight. Yeah. So statistically, there is a big portion of those people asking how to make more money, but their body doesn't reflect what their investments to a point where they'd be able to liquidate their investments. They'd be so unhealthy, it's pointless having the money in the bank anyway. Now,
that's an insightful comment, I guess. Yeah, that's true.
It's almost like, why would you invest when your body's going to be,
so just to be clear, so you're saying, why would you sacrifice now in order to have like £1 million when you're 60, if when you're 60 you're going to be on death's door anyway? Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So it backs up the point of, it might be boring, but it's a necessity. But here's the thing: if you're earning an income and you only have £100 left at the end of the month, and you're thinking, well, we can go out for a meal, or we can do this, or we can, do whatever for instant gratification, or I can invest £100. Well, it doesn't have to be boring. This is my second part. we're in a world right now where it's never been more accessible. I'm not saying easy, but it's never been more accessible to cash flow. So rather than being on the defensive and saying, well, as a cost of living, I don't have any excess money, and my £100, I'm certainly not putting that into a stocks and shares. And even if I did a tenner, what's the point? No one's stopping you, as I have done, as you have done, to learn, evolve, and go on the offense to make
Mm.
more money so that it's not so boring, so that you can speed up to your point of it might take you to your 30s. It might, because investing can be slow. It's slow and steady wins the race. But no one's stopping you from getting home, turning off Netflix, stopping the doom scrolling, educating, and going on the offense to bring in more money to invest a larger amount, making it therefore a bit more exciting.
Yeah, but that, look, that's, I agree with that. But so I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, if you get into the mindset that the investment bit, and again, I'm differentiating between investing and trading, right? And investing is this really boring thing, fine, but it's something that you absolutely have to do. And if you do it, it can be life changing. And you have to do it because no government's gonna be able to fund you. Like, so you're gonna have a grindingly awful, poor retirement. But also, if you do it well and if you do it for long enough, you'll be able to have better cars, you'll have a deposit on a house, you'll be able to afford a wedding, you'll be able to help your kids out when they need to go to university, like all these, but things that happen over the very long run. Obviously, a fair amount of that takes a while to get to. But if you start yourself on that road, as we said earlier, if you start at 25 quid a month in your early 20s, you go through just this from getting on, changing that trajectory to get on that habit track. You're very likely to do a much better job with your finances, big picture, right, and have a life-changing outcome, even if you start really small. To your point, I think there should be a line in the sand in your life that says that is literally one of my very, very, very top priorities in my life beyond everything else. And I calibrate my life. I calibrate where I live. I calibrate my expenditure. I calibrate how I behave. And there's a complete line in the sand which says that has to happen from the minute I start earning money in my 20s, if at all possible, forever, for my whole life. Because if you do it, you'll have a much better outcome in your life than if you don't do it, right? The doing exciting thing and earning more, and I believe you can make that happen almost within reason, no matter how much you earn. Like certainly from an average British income onwards, because if we're all really ruthless and use a spreadsheet and look at our budgeting and go work out what we're spending our money on, somebody on 36 grand, as I said earlier, should be able to find 400 quid a month across their pension, and that is more than enough to make a huge difference to your life, right? Sort of roughly stock market returns. So, and somebody on a bit less who's a bit younger, fine, then you can't find 400 quid a month, but you should probably be able to find 100 quid a month, right? And if people are really ruthlessly honest with themselves about what they're spending, they've got to be able to find 50 or 25, depending on what age. And if you're in like mid 30s and you're in a fairly highly paid job, you should be finding a lot more than that. I mean, I see all this stuff online about people saying, I've got a 600 quid a month car payment. It's like I'm 50 and I've spent 25 or 27 years in financial services. My car payment when I had one was 150 quid a month. You're like, are you kidding me? Like of course you'll never become wealthy if you spend 600 quid. And so many people make those sorts of incredibly stupid decisions. They I can't afford to invest. It's like, no, you're looking at it the wrong way around. The investing piece is the first thing you do before meals out, before Netflix, and you've got to do it, even if it's only a small amount, but you've got to do that. Then the earning more money and doing exciting stuff and investing in crypto and trading currency and whatever else you might want to do, that can be a completely separate thing in your life, right? The exciting whiz bang, maybe you'll be really good, maybe you will buy Bitcoin at 5,000 and turn it into 100,000 and have 1 million quid, whatever. But my key point and my key crusade is that, probably 3 to 5% of British people have properly done what I just said. They've properly sorted out their pension, their ISA. They've properly got into a life habit of investing every month. Guess what? They're the 3 to 5% of richest people in the country. I know that's really unpalatable. People don't want to hear that. But the richest 1% of people in the world are generally the people the most financially literate 1% of people in the world, because of the power of compounding, and particularly, to be fair, over generations. Like if you compound, if your grandfather was good at this and your father was good at this and you're good at this, you will, that all compounds over many, many years. I mean, I always go back to the story of like Taylor Swift is the first pop starlet to become a billionaire in history. And, however many tens of thousands of other girls are there in the world who are as good looking, as good at dancing, as good at songwriting, and blah, 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 but didn't become Taylor Swift. Do you know what Taylor Swift's secret weapon is? And this does sound like, it's unfair and nefarious, but it's kind of what I'm talking about. It's compounding over time. Is her dad was a multi-millionaire who worked for the investment bank Merrill Lynch. So when Taylor needed a recording studio and a guitar and a whatever, and a father who understood legal contracts, so she's been compounding her music career for all of her career and all of her dad's career, and that happens. And the way society wants to mitigate that is because is inheritance tax and the fact that rich people pay a load of tax, notwithstanding what people like Gary Stevenson might want you to have believe. The top 1% pay 30% of the tax, and that's just the income tax. But anyway, and another example of that, by the way, is Bruce Jenner, right? And the Kardashians and the Jenners, because he was an Olympic gold medalist, right? What's Bruce Jenner called now since he or she had a sex change?
Yeah, I can't bloody remember.
Yeah, but anyway, but the point is, these families, and that's nepotism and nepo baby. But my point is just that compounding over time, over many, many years, delivers extraordinary results. And that's why everyone needs to get into it and everyone needs to do it. Sorry, I'm rambling, but broadly, just make damn sure that you learn enough to sort out your pension, your ISA, and get it done as early in your life as you can. And by the way, it's never too late. Like if you haven't sorted it out in your early 40s, you will bloody well get it done then, right? And then, all the other stuff, trading crypto, whatever. I mean, frankly, I think that's a great big waste of time because you're statistically very unlikely to succeed over the long run, for all the reasons said earlier, and because it takes a load of time. And to your point, actually, a far higher ROI on making money out of your time is probably doing something other than looking at trading screens all day. Like there's a higher probability that ways of making money from deploying your time than spending hours and hours and hours in crypto groups trying to scalp, some move in an altcoin. But that's just my view.
Well, we're going to move on to the management of money and ignoring social media, because this is one of the biggest downfalls to why people, A, don't have money, and two, when they do have money, they go and spend it or they go and invest it on the wrong things, is by very smart marketing and manipulation of social media and the feeling of keeping up with the Joneses and wanting to go back to your point of £600 on a finance car, wanting to look rich to compete with the online world, but actually going home to, nothing really, because there's no assets, there's nothing in the bank, but it's looking the part,
well,
right?
By the way, wealth is the money you haven't spent.
Well, wealth,
right, which is
there's a great saying, wealth whispers.
But if you've spent the money on a flash car or on designer clothes or a Hermes handbag or whatever, you don't have that wealth anymore. You have a depreciating, right? And so but by the way, I think you do know this. There's a brilliant book called The Psychology of Money by a guy called Morgan Housel. And that is an absolute must read because it's around this. You can have all the information like we said earlier, but if you don't get your psychology right, you make all these mistakes. So anyway, sorry, go on.
That's a great book. That is Psychology of Money. Now, the management, and when I say money management, this also ties into social media. So this is a real problem for people because especially young individuals who have access to social media. So my son has access to a phone, but we don't have social media on there apart from YouTube. Yeah, just so we can watch my channel.
So he can watch you. Yeah,
just so he can watch
me, hopefully.
But other than that, it's controlling that management, and this should be taught in schools. It's not. Actually, Andrew, we never spoke about it, but luckily I got accepted for Global Academy. So I'm able to go into universities around London and talk about this stuff, right? And they have no idea about how susceptible they are to the influence of smart marketing. All of it is smart marketing. And it's the download of these apps. And really going back to it is that the management of money, again, stems from good discipline. Everything is downstream from discipline. And managing money is key to what you actually do with the money. But most importantly, and what I want to touch on here is beat sort of home about ignoring social media and what other people are doing. Because one thing I get asked a lot, mate, and I haven't seen all the comments that are on here. I'm sure we've had some, we have, is that I get asked a lot, and I'm no advisor, I'm no financial expert. I've done well with my money. But there are so many people, which scares me, that says, what should I do with my 5 grand? What should I do with my 10 grand? And it's almost like people are looking for everyone else to suggest what they should do with their money, which scares me because everyone's circumstances are different. But I feel
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is
yeah.
social media. What should I do with my money that will give me? I follow this guy and he has all this. I have no idea if he has rich parents, which a lot of people do have rich parents. Just for anyone listening,
Mm,
they hide it
mm.
very well. Um, is that they're looking for an answer to what they should invest their money in, and that's scary, and that is a byproduct
Well, and
of.
also, by the way, no, you should never ever listen to anyone who tells you how to invest a certain amount of money. Like, how do I invest 5 grand? How do I invest 50 grand? How do I invest 10 grand? And the reason for that is because the answer is 100% dependent on your personal circumstances. To your point, like if I'm 20 and I'm at uni, the way I should invest 5 grand or what I should do with 5 grand is completely night and day different to what somebody who's 60 and a multi-millionaire might do with 5 grand, right? And that's why, like, so anybody who's regulated by the FCA, by the UK financial regulator, as I am, for what it's worth, you're legally obliged to do what's called a KYC and know your client. You have to know all of the details of the individual that you're talking to before you can give them any advice about what to do with their money, because of that point, because it's completely different depending on how much you earn, what's your mortgage, what are your dependents, how many kids have you got, what's your ambition for when you retire, what's your attitude to risk. And all these people online, particularly in the crypto space, going, you should do this thing with your money, have not taken account of any of that. And that is actually, in the regulated arena, that's illegal. But if I it's going to come back to you. It's gone. I was going to come back to you on another point, but I'll shut up and come back to you.
Well, it might come back to you, but that is one of the
Ah,
biggest that is one of the biggest killers, is the influence of social media. So yeah, just for anyone listening, is that, and Andrew just touched on it, if you have money or you have excess amount of capital to invest, it has to be 100% your decision on where your money goes. And it has to be based on your specific circumstances for you and your family. You should never ask anyone, where should I invest? Andrew, you
and
might.
be clear, and also be clear whether you're investing or trading, and understand the difference to those two things. And I would say that most people should absolutely focus first and foremost on investing. And until they've got that sorted, they shouldn't be doing any trading. They shouldn't be anywhere near it. By the way, just on your point about social media and bad influence, if I can just come back, because that's what I was going to say before I kind of lost my thread. So there are a couple of things. So I talk about 4 ways to invest so that crashes don't matter, right? And I won't go into all of them in detail, but one of them is automation. Because basically, the quicker you are to just set something up that happens every month automatically, regardless of everything else going on in your life, right? And you adjust to that reality, and it's automatic. It happens by direct debit into a fixed set of things that you've started. And you've done the ad, like you cut once and you sort of a life. You've done the one job, and then it carries on every month for 5 years, 10 years, do the same thing, right? And I talk about all of this. So automation is really important to basically prevent yourself, or maximize the chance that you do something every month, and prevent yourself from messing around with it and go, oh, I'm not going to invest this month because I had a massive piss up and went clubbing, or whatever it might be, right? Once you get that automation going, because then you forget about it and you recalibrate your life to work with it. The other thing I just want to talk about is the power of what psychologists call reframing, when it comes to like, how do you ignore the siren song of, how do you develop discipline? What psychological tools and tricks are there? And one of the most powerful ones is reframing. And I'm just going to, before I go into reframing vis-a-vis finance, I want to use an example from actually the world of healthcare to show how powerful reframing is, because it's sort of, it sounds a bit like glass half full, half empty kind of semi bullshit, but listen to this as an example. So it's called the surgery example. So if you have a life-threatening condition where the surgical procedure required, like let's say to remove a brain tumor or some major surgery, has a 5% chance of killing you, and a 95% chance of all going smoothly and you recover in the recovery room and you're fine and you've been cured of that horrendous thing, right? If a surgeon or a clinician or a doctor sits across from the patient and says to them, we need to do this operation to save your life because you've got this life-threatening cancer, it has a 95% chance of success. That person's probability of saying, okay, we should do that, is really high. If you say it's not, if they say, we have to let you know that you will have a 5% chance of death. You've got a 5% chance of dying. Statistically, the person who hears that message is much less likely to have the operation, even though the two statistical outcomes are exactly the same, 95% and 5%, right? So the reason I mention that is because I sort of say that as because it's really powerful, and there's loads of evidence about this, and it's just how the human brain works. And so you want to leverage how the human brain works to succeed in life and to beat these psychological problems, right? And the way that reframing can be applied to finance that's really powerful is don't think about how to save money. Do not think, how can I save 10% of what I earn every month in an ISA or whatever? Think, reframe it, turn it on its head. Think, how can I spend 90% of everything I earn every month having the best possible life for me personally, right? And as ridiculous as that sounds, because it goes back to the surgery, I was like, well, they're the same thing. Like saving 10% each month or spending 90% each month is the same thing, except that by virtue of the psychological power of that reframe, if you sit down and work out back from I earn this much every month and go, right, I'm going to get a flat that costs this much. I'm going to buy a car that costs this much. I'm going to buy this, spend this much on clothes. You actually are proactively, firstly, you have an abundance mindset, as cheesy as that sounds, because you're like excited. You're like, what can I spend everything I earn on, right? And secondly, you inherently create a much, much more detailed plan, right? And you're working from a place of, I want to have the best possible life. So how am I going to spend all this money on having the best possible life on all the things I love? You love pets, or you love sport, or you love a season ticket, or whatever you might do. And for many people, if you do that and you're left with this rump of 10% left over after you've done the exercise, you're doing considered spending, like thoughtful, mindful spending. You're maximizing your life outcomes based on what you like or what you love, and you end up with that 10% left over to save. And that is a much more specific trajectory to getting the outcome than sort of this amorphous, like, oh, I need to save 10%, which won't happen. And like generally that's like finance coaches and people talk about this stuff all the time, those who are good and know, but this stuff actually works. So that's why I would say, if you want to avoid the siren song of being targeted by social media ads, and work out, and actually, by the way, if you earn a bit more and you're lucky enough to have a highly paid job, work out how to live on 85% of your money or 80% of your money or 75% of your money until such time as, and if you do that, you will set up all the right direct debits, you'll calibrate your life, you'll have fun, you'll do the things you love doing, you won't be pissing money away on stupid shit that you don't actually want, and you will achieve this investing thing that I'm talking about, which is life-changing. That you sort out your ISA, you sort out your pension, and 20 years or 30 years or certainly 40 years later, you have a lot of money. And the tragedy is that probably less than 1% of the population is doing that.
It's mad, isn't it? And I've just made some notes. So sort of as we come to a close, I just want to go over a couple of things that you mentioned. And I'm glad you did, because it was one of the things that I wanted to touch on, the emotion side of it. So I use the case of the quickest way to lose money is making conscious decisions there and then. If you have bad decision making already like built into you, right, is the emotion.
Yeah.
So I use the example of if you've ever lent a friend money, and you have to put, or if a friend lent you money, sorry, and you have to pay them back, when you're paid weekly or monthly and you have that extra £50 or £100 left over, and you're left with that emotional feeling that you're in control of, to think, well, I've been invited out this weekend, so I'll tell you what, I'll pay them back next week. It's fine. Whereas if you have that standing order, you remove the emotion out of it, and a smarter choice, a smarter thing has happened because there's been no emotion. So I did a video which luckily got, well, not luckily, but it got me national press about my, at the time, 33 bank accounts and my financial structure. Everything that I do is automated. So apart from tweaking things, so there's no emotion. So that was point number one. Number two, money not being the root of all evil. I think, again, the rewiring, like you said, that the reframing, the resetting of, maybe question who you're listening to if they have a bad relationship with money, that they're probably not people you want to be around. You want to be around what you said, the abundance.
And can I interrupt there? So I've just finished the How to Own the World Before You're 30 new edition of my book that's for under 30, for people up to the age of 30, to my publisher. And I literally began the very first chapter, the introduction, on that point, saying money is the root of all evil is probably the stupidest, most unhelpful comment of all time, because all that money is a technology. It's basically it's a store of value. It's to syndicate risk. It's to allocate capital over wealth over time. It's to sort of roughly allocate resources based loosely on merit. And the capital markets, the stock markets, bond markets, commodity markets that developed as an addendum to money, similar thing. And the point I want to make is that before humans invented that technology, we were massively poorer and our lives were massively worse. So if you look at when money, and particularly capital markets based on money, were fully invented and sorted out, and look at what humanity has achieved since then, money is actually probably the single most important and beneficial technology in the history of our species for people having better lives and flourishing. It's just a technology. So yeah, anyway, I wanted to throw that in there.
And I've always said, when people say, well, the best things in life are free, and I turn around and say, when was the last time you saw a homeless couple happy? You don't. So it doesn't exist. So money is certainly not the root of all evil. Number three, you touched on it, the way that you perceive things, the way that you hear things. So I run a monthly membership, and it's £60 a month, right? Now, I can say to people, it's £60 a month, or it's £2 a day. It's less than a coffee. They prefer the hit. It's less than a coffee per day in order to be a part of a high performing community, rather than saying the bigger number. To say it's less than a coffee and it's only £2 a day, they're like, I can do that. And then it's
Yeah,
much more
exactly.
accessible. So again, the psychology. And then number four, knowing what you want. I think this is the core of all of your financial decisions. And I think, again, going back to social media, doing such a damaging job of blurring what you actually want. And I'll give an example. What do I want? All I ever wanted was to not be in a job, to have freedom, to follow my passions, my dreams, to be able to go on holiday whenever I want, which I'm literally just about to jet off, to make decisions. I'm not a materialistic kind of guy, as I sit here in my Primark t-shirt, my Primark shorts, and to do exactly what I want when I want without permission from anyone, and to live a very humble life, know that I've got money in the bank, that I can ride any financial wave, which I can, and get up every day. And that's all I want. It's not about the fancy car. And I think when you know what you want, the earlier that happens, you then have purpose, you ignore pleasure, and then your financial decisions make sense because you have a target, you have purpose, but it's knowing what you want. And just quickly, Andrew, obviously we're on a live stream right now. I've done this before with my TikTok followers and stuff like that, and people who join my live stream. I say to them with urgency, tell me in the comments right now, if you could have the perfect lifestyle and you could have a certain amount of money a month, tell me how much money would make you happy in the comments section. What do you think the most common ones are? What do you think they are?
10 grand a month.
10 grand a month, 15 grand a month. And there's always someone who goes, I want 35 grand, 40 grand a month. And because they have no idea, because they have been influenced by social media to think that they must have the £10,000 a month, when most of these people only need probably £3,272 to live a better life because their salary job is £1,900 a month.
Yeah.
That's my final point. So I suppose my final point to you as we finish, understanding to know what you want. How do you understand and maybe have a target in place financially to then make those moves?
Yeah, and also there's a really important difference in kind of like, mining and agriculture, by which I mean, if you spend it, like if you think you want a flash car and loads of designer clothes, right? And you could get a load of credit card debt to get that right now and have a massive car payment, right? You're mining, you're taking a supply of money, well, actually your net negative supply of money, and it's all gone, and you've destroyed your ability to make money in future. So that's the reason mining and farming, right? Mining, there's a certain amount of whatever you're mining, and then it's all gone, and it's gone. Farming, you're creating stuff that, you're planting every year and you have a yield every year. So in the vernacular of money, if you mine all your money to zero because you've pissed it all away on designer clothes and a flash car, and you have no money left, you can never farm money. Whereas if you build up loads of money over here, you can have an income, reasonably soon you can have an income which allows you to buy those things without mining it to zero. And that's a really important thing to understand. So yeah, if you do want those things, that's fine, but just do your best to make sure that you can have those things from a farming effort, not a mining effort. Because the worst thing of all is to think you want those things and then have them. And like everybody knows, it's a really well known, it's called the hedonic adjustment, right? Is that you get a brand new sports car and it's magic and you get in it and it's amazing. You're like, look at my car, it's great. And honestly, within about 2 weeks, it's like the novelty's so badly, savagely worn off. And that's true of almost everything that you might spend money on. And there are loads of tricks to stop, like, for example, if you think you really want to buy something like a gaming console or a massive flat screen TV or whatever it might, or a handbag or whatever it might be, just don't do it for 72 hours or a week. Just say, right, okay, and if a week later you still feel really but just never buy anything on impulse. And ideally what you want to do is, to the mining versus farming slightly crap analogy that I used a minute ago, but the broad point stands. What you want to do is get to a point where you've built your farm to a point where you can have you can have what you want. To your point, what do you want? Enough to be free and to pay the bills every month, and that's it. And then actually, ironically, if you get to that point, you have the freedom to create businesses. You have the freedom to invest. And then 20 years from now, I'm sure you will be able to buy whatever the hell you want over and above that fairly frugal lifestyle. And if you want a Dolce & Gabbana t-shirt instead of a Primark t-shirt, if you can be asked with that, you'll be able to, but you'll be doing it out of your farm, not out of your mind. That's the point. And that mindset's really, really, it's so tragic when you see people in their late 20s who've got 40 grand of credit card debt because they hit it hard in Ibiza and they, had a flash BMW when they were 22. It's like, just be patient. Don't do that, or rent stuff, but to my point is, it doesn't have to be a massive sacrifice. As if you just sort that 10-ish% into your ISA and your pension, then by the time you're into your kind of mid to late 30s, that will start making a difference. And if you get into that habit, you tend to save more and invest more, and it goes much quicker than people realize.
Do you know, I have a friend, I've got many who are very wealthy now, but I have a friend who's got a huge company in London. He's called Michael Howard, and he's had everything. Like, he's worth over 350 odd million. And I do remember asking him it wasn't one of the first times, but it was one time I went up to his office near the Shard and I said to him, what is it like to have all that money? Because one day he showed me, and he was showing me some of the finances that they've got going on in the business and business reserves. And you're talking about 30-40 million just sitting there, right, in reserves. And he said, I've got all the Rolexes. He said, I've got about 15 Rolexes. He took the one that he was wearing, he threw it on his big sofa. He said, all means nothing. He said, I've had the Rolls Royce, we've had the Aston. He said, I've had every car. I've got the country house. I've got houses abroad. He said, the one thing that I will say about money is, he said, I don't put up with any, and I'm not swearing because of the YouTube algorithm, but he doesn't put up with any BS, and he can do whatever the hell he wants without authorization. That's what I.
That's it. Well, they say, you want to work when you want, where you want, and with whom you want. And those are the three key things that give, because you don't have to work with people you don't like. You don't have to do things you don't want to do. And if you want to do that, if you're excited to do that in somewhere other than, wherever you happen to grow up in the world, which, if you grow up in a pretty rubbish place, you might want to move on. That's the ultimate freedom of money. And of course, the more you spend on Rolexes and stuff, because that's the real tragedy, is if you haven't got that yet, but you're spending money on Rolexes, you're stopping yourself from getting to that point, and that's what makes you happy,
Do you know, I'll just share, let me share this story just before we wrap up, right? I was in the gym, Andrew, and I've driven pants cars most of my life. Like, we were driving cars, like, we've been in no money situations, right? I don't come from a family that had a penny, right? And when I got myself in a better situation, I was in the gym, and this is, I started to build up my TikTok, and this young guy came up to me. He was saying, "Oh, I watch your stuff," and blah blah blah. I said, "Cool." Anyway, I had a little runaround car, which I actually still have now, right? It's a little I call it my little pop pot, right? But I got a couple of nice cars now, right? But I have this little runaround. And anyway, I parked it up where I normally parked it, and it fits in this little space where my other cars can't. And anyway, he walked out the gym with me, and he goes, he was walking to the co-op past my car, and I stopped with my car, and he said, "Oh, is that your car?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, I would have thought you'd have been driving something different." And I said, "Well, that's what social. This is what we were talking about in the gym. This is what social media
Yeah,
is
yeah,
for.
yeah, yeah,
You've painted an image of me, which you believe that social media should reflect on me." And he said, "Oh,
yeah,
right."
yeah,
I said, but let me tell you this. I do have a couple of nice cars, but where are you going now?" And he went, "Well, I've got to get my lunch for work." I said, "I'm not going to work."
yeah.
And that is the whole
Yeah, yeah,
point.
yeah, exactly. That
You
brought it
know,
home. Exactly right. Yeah,
you're
yeah,
you're off to do a 10, 12 hour shift. I'm off home, I'm gonna go cook some food and probably work from a nice
yeah.
bar restaurant. So it's the whole wealth whispers, and that's something that I like remaining quiet and humble and not flashing stuff because, well, I'm not like that as a person anyway, but I
Mm.
like to know that there is financial comfort. So this has been a great podcast. Is there anything you want people to go check out? Obviously, I'm gonna, I always talk about your stuff anyway, but we can put some bits in the description.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm conscious we didn't get into the kind of actually, okay, so what investments do you do, and the nuts and bolts of, like, if you're going to get that 10% a month into this and sort your ISA and your pension, okay, what's next? And I was going to talk about global equities, basically getting the balance. There's this idea of 100 minus your age, which helps you get the balance between riskier, higher return investments and lower risk, lower return investments as you get older. Because, like, having a 50% stock market correction when you've got 10 grand when you're 30 is a very different problem to having a 50% stock market correction when you've got a million quid and you're 60. So you need to legislate for that. And that's the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle for my kind of whole approach to how to invest for anyone. And so, yeah, if people are interested in finding out those nuts and bolts, I've got a YouTube channel, as you know, which is Plain English Finance on YouTube. My first book's called How to Own the World. That's it over my shoulder there. My second book's called Live on Less, Invest the Rest, which is the practice for a British national. I've just sort of laboured over producing my third one, which is called Our Future is Biotech, which, well, I'll put it this way. Basically, the US stock market's returned more than 10% annualized for more than a century, and it's done that because of tech. And we kind of all understand that, right? Aeroplanes and smartphones and the internet and silicon and whatever. And the reason I wrote that book is because I think the way that wealth creation, that human progress continues into the next century is because of biology and biotech, which is why I just wrote that book about it. So, God, yeah, that's enough promoter and stuff. But come and check out our YouTube channel because it's a free course in effective financial literacy, basically.
I love that. Is there a certain video that we can put that will dive into the nuts and bolts? Maybe you can
Uh,
send me a link and then I
Yeah,
can.
sure. I mean, basically, if you watch the very first video, I mean, I think it's pinned to the page when you land there, and it's basically an introduction to what it is. But I think we just did our 41st video in like 17 months. We really want people to watch the videos in order because it's just an effective education in financial history and how to sort this stuff. You don't have to watch all 40 videos. You can get most of the way there and probably half a dozen of them, and hopefully it'll be obvious to people which ones those are. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'll share the sort of gateway drug video for you for your show notes.
love that. And just for anyone that when Andrew said silicon, we don't mean what's in boobs. We mean Silicon Valley.
Yeah, correct. What's in microchips? Yeah,
Because someone might be thinking tech, silicon,
yeah,
money now. Do I need to start
yeah.
investing into clinics? Cool. Look, Andrew, it's been a pleasure as always. I love doing these, mate, and I love this back and forth and talking about this. You can tell we like finance. And to everyone
Yeah.
who has so far, thanks so much. Do go check out Andrew's channel. Everything will be in the description. And until next time, we will see you all very soon.